네, 감사합니다.
Thank you.
우리 새예루살렘 성가대
Our New Jerusalem choir has given to us a great moving in our heart. Continuing on from last week, the redemptive administration of the Last Supper with Jesus. We'll have part 2 today. Last time, if we review the contents that we studied, before being nailed to the cross, Jesus earnestly desired to share the Passover meal with his disciples. So if you look in Luke chapter 22, verse 15, he says, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So earnestly desired. However, Jesus was unable to eat this Passover meal. Firstly, let's look at the content of Jesus' desire. In Luke chapter 22, verse 15, I've earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. So I earnestly desired. If you look at the New Living Translation, it says, I've been very eager to eat this Passover meal with you before my suffering begins. So very eager. Jesus sincerely desired this. Now, if that's the case, what are the foods required for this Passover feast? At the time of the Passover, there was the requirement of the Passover lamb, and then also the unleavened bread, and lastly, bitter herbs. This is in Exodus chapter 12. If you look in Exodus chapter 12, verse 6, you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. This is regarding the lamb. So the first food is the Passover lamb. Even in Exodus chapter 12, verse 8, they shall eat the flesh that same night, that flesh of the lamb, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Secondly, it is the unleavened bread. And this unleavened bread is bread without yeast. If yeast goes into the dough, then the dough would rise and it becomes very fluffy and soft. But unleavened bread, because there's no yeast, it becomes very hard. Ezekiel chapter 45, verse 21, in the first month, on the 14th day of the month, you shall have the Passover, a feast of 7 days. Unleavened bread shall be eaten. So this unleavened bread. Thirdly, it is the bitter herbs. This bitter herbs signifies the pain and suffering that Israel had to endure while passing through the wilderness on their way to Canaan. It says in Numbers chapter 9, verse 11, in the second month on the 14th day at twilight. But sometimes there's special cases where they can't keep it this day, right? For example, if people travel or come late, these people can keep it on the second month of the 14th day. And it says here they should eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. If our father is in the hospital and in a few days he's going to die, and that father gives us his final request, he says, before I leave this world, I want to eat lamb. If our father had said such a thing, then a filial son would prepare this lamb no matter what it took. But the disciples of Jesus, even though Jesus was right before the cross, that lamb, the unleavened bread, and the bitter herbs that Jesus desired to eat, none of the disciples prepared this. Did Jesus truly have this Passover meal? He couldn't. Why? Because there was no Passover lamb. in that Passover feast, there was no lamb. The disciples did not prepare this lamb. Even if the children are poor, they would think to themselves, our father wants to eat lamb. Let's all pitch in a little bit. Let's all collect our money and buy some for him. Wouldn't the sons do something like this? So Jesus' disciples, there's not one, but there's 12 of them. And if 12 of them came together, do you think that they couldn't prepare this lamb? But none of them were awake. None of them protected the words of Jesus and understood it. Secondly, they prepared the bread, but it was not unleavened bread. Matthew chapter 26, verse 26, while they were eating, Jesus took some bread, and after a blessing, he broke it. This bread, it is a Greek word. It is not the Greek word for azimos. Bread here is artos. And artos is the type of bread that Jews typically ate. It is leavened bread, so it has yeast. Matthew chapter 14, verse 19 says, he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up towards heaven, he blessed the food, and breaking the loaves. So at this time, that Greek word artos is used here as well. So this bread is leavened bread. The one on the left is the leavened bread. And so it rises. It's very easy and good to eat. But the one on the right is the bread with no yeast. It's the unleavened bread. And so you see that because there's no yeast, it doesn't rise. It's very hard. And it's difficult to eat. Unleavened bread is bread without yeast. And in Greek, it is azimos. Azimos. The prefix a, it means to negate something or something without. And zuine is yeast. Juime. Juime is yeast. So ajuime, ajimos, would be without yeast. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 8, with the unleavened bread. And here it is that Greek word, azimos. Ultimately, although Jesus came as the Passover lamb, he would take away the sins of the world. He was unable to have the Passover meal and was crucified. So in John chapter 1, verse 29, or 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7, it talks about Jesus who takes upon the sins of all mankind, that sacrificial lamb. So the lessons regarding Jesus not having the Passover meal. In April 7th, 2013, in the Sunday second service by our founding pastor, Reverend Abraham Park, he talks about this. And at the time, the sermon title was "The Lord Who Earnestly Desires the Last Passover Meal Before His Suffering." If you look at the contents, it's recorded as such. The bread that Jesus broke and ate with his disciples at the Last Supper was not unleavened bread, azimos, but it was leavened bread, artos. So he taught us this way. He also says Jesus was unable to have the Passover meal before he died. Beloved Pyeonggang saints, please remember this until the day we go to heaven. Also, he said this in his sermon. The Last Supper Jesus had with his disciples before he was crucified was never the Passover meal. It was a final dinner with his disciples. It wasn't a Passover meal. And it was a special meal commemorating the death of Jesus. It is not the Passover meal. Did they prepare a lamb? Did they prepare unleavened bread? This is how he said it in his sermon. And the unfortunate thing is the illegal occupants that are taking over the church as they published their version of the 12th book. If you look in page 413, it is different than what our senior pastor had taught us. How is it recorded in their book? 3 occasions. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the last day of Jesus' earthly ministry, Jesus shared the Passover dinner with his disciples. When did Jesus have the Passover dinner? He never did. Is there not even one spiritually awake person in the church? If there is one person spiritually awake, then that person could have said, is this not the way that senior pastor had taught us? It goes against it. And the more unfortunate thing is, even though we teach them, they will not fix what they made a mistake of. They continue to teach the wrong things. How can these people take the legacy of our late senior pastor and claim to be disciples of him? It also says this in their book. On the evening that began Friday, the 13th of Nisan, the first month, Jesus shared the Passover meal with his disciples, then went up to the Mount of Olives to pray. So Jesus never shared this Passover meal. So he goes up to the Mount of Olives to pray. And the third instance in their book, after sharing the Passover meal with his disciples, Jesus went ahead to the Mount of Olives to pray. He did not share such a Passover meal. He went forward to the Mount of Olives to pray. After having this Passover meal, they shamelessly publish these things that go against the teaching of our senior pastor. So then what is the reason why Jesus' disciples were unable to prepare this Passover meal? It's all because of the disciples. Firstly, it was because there was a dispute about who is the greatest among the 12 disciples. Luke chapter 22, verse 24. And there arose also a dispute among them as to which one of them was regarded to be greatest. This is a dispute in Jesus' final feast before he is about to go on the cross. If it's tomorrow, Jesus will have to die on the cross. And this night, as Jesus prays in the Garden of Gethsemane, after 12 p.m., the early night, he'll be captured. The disciples didn't know any of this. And instead, amongst each other, they fight and say, am I the greatest? I'm the greatest. If Jesus takes over Jerusalem and he conquers all, then who's going to be the greatest to stand with him? This is how they were fighting. And so within those disciples that were disputing, do you think within their ears, the words of Jesus that earnestly desire to have this Passover meal, would those words have reached them? This fight was a very fierce fight. They didn't use their fists, but it was a very fierce fight. Luke chapter 22, verse 24, the term dispute is translated from the Greek word philoneikia. And this is referring to a very fierce fight. It comes from philos, meaning liking or loving, and neikos, meaning strife or fight. So the word of like and the word of fight is combined. It means the disciples love to fight. The disciples, even at the table of the Last Supper, fought fiercely over who would take power. What point is it? Who's more powerful? Jesus is going to die tomorrow. What's the point of being the greatest? But the good thing is that after everything happened, the disciples repented and they received the Holy Spirit, and they went all around the world, except for Judas Iscariot, and they all proclaimed the gospel. At that moment, the disciples, as they went about their mission, don't you think that they reflected back in the time when all of them fought, and they fought on the day before Jesus was crucified? They reflect back to themselves and, oh man, why did I do that? I'm sure they came to their senses and regretted their actions. Everyone in this world, the power and the authority, the acknowledgement of men, it's all vanity. It's useless. What would be the point of holding on to such useless things? Look at the powerful people of our nation. You think they're going to go on for a long time? Even all the powerful CEOs of companies, they all left this world. The power of this world, the authority of this world is not eternal. But those who do the will of the Father, that is what's eternal. 1 John chapter 2, verse 15 to 17. Please take a look at this. All things will perish. They'll fade. But the will of God is eternal. So we must not hold on to the power and authority of this world. We must let those things go. And we must only cling on to the Father's will. And I bless all of you in the name of the Lord. Secondly, this fight was a fight that had nothing to do with God's will. God's will was for Jesus to take upon himself all the sins of mankind and be crucified on the cross. But even this will, the disciples, if they didn't have even an inkling of understanding this within their heart. They were entrapped in their desire for power. Jesus offered a prayer clinging to the Father's will in the Garden of Gethsemane. Matthew chapter 26, verse 39, and he went a little beyond them and fell on his face and prayed, saying, My Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will. And he prayed this so fervently that in Luke chapter 22, verse 44, his sweat became like drops of blood. And in agony, he prayed even more. However, the disciples, caught up in their desire for power, they were arguing about who is the greatest. So how could they hear the words, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer? Those sad words of Jesus, none of it reached their ears. It went in one and out the other. Secondly, the reason why the disciples could not prepare this Passover meal is because Judas Iscariot went out to betray Jesus. If Judas Iscariot did not slip away to sell Jesus, then Jesus could have had this Passover meal. See, originally, the Passover meal was supposed to start on Friday before he passed away. But at 3 p.m. on Friday, he was on the cross. So if he was not on the cross, he would have been able to eat the Passover meal. Originally, the religious leaders, it was in the middle of the festival. So we can't kill Jesus now. It's going to be a huge riot. So, even though we want to kill Jesus, let's wait a little bit, stay still, and let's wait until after the Passover. Then let's kill him. That's the original plan that they had. But all of a sudden, Judas Iscariot comes to them and says, hey, I'll give Jesus to you. He went to them to give Jesus. He got 30 shekels of silver. And so, hey, we wanted to kill him after the festival, but man, the heavens are helping us now. One of his own disciples wants to sell Jesus, and he went to come find us. He said he's going to give him to us. This is a very fortunate event for us. Let's bring forward our entire plan and kill him right now. So because of Judas, the religious leaders who wanted to kill Jesus, they brought their plan forward. If their plan wasn't brought forward, he would have been able to have that Passover meal on Friday. Matthew chapter 26, verse 2-5. You know that after 2 days, the Passover is coming. So it's not yet. The Passover is not yet. And the Son of Man is to be handed over for crucifixion. Then the chief priests and the elders of the people were gathered together in the court of the high priest named Caiaphas. And they plotted together to seize Jesus by stealth and kill him. But they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise a riot might occur among the people. So this is Wednesday of the Passion Week. Friday is the Passover. So they're saying, hey, if we kill him during Passover, a big riot's going to take place. We can't do that. So let's wait until after Passover. And then there's another feast after Passover. So they have to wait about a week. So the religious leaders wanted to wait a week and then kill Jesus. But because of Judas's actions, all of this was brought forward. Mark chapter 14, verse 1-2. It says, Now the Passover and unleavened bread were 2 days away, and the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to seize him by stealth and kill him. For they were saying, not during the festival, otherwise there might be a riot of the people. So clearly, they didn't want to do this yet. But the disciple of Jesus came forward and said that he would sell him. So it was a very fortunate event for them. John chapter 18, verse 28. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas into the praetorium, and it was early. This is Friday, the dawn of Friday. And they themselves did not enter into the praetorium so that they would not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. This is the dawn of Friday. The Passover meal time is not yet, because it is Friday at 3 p.m. that it begins. But all the Pilate and his officials are all foreigners. So if the Jews go into the court of the foreigners, they thought that their bodies would be defiled, and they can't eat the Passover meal in a defiled state. So they said, we're not going to go into there. The reason they didn't go into there is so that they can eat the Passover meal. It's clearly recorded here. So if Jesus did not die on Friday, the Jews are all take part in the Passover meal. However, the plan to arrest him was moved forward because Judas Iscariot suddenly betrayed Jesus. Matthew 26, verse 14 to 16. Then one of the 12, named Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What are you willing to give me to betray him to you?" You know, the religious leaders, they didn't make the deal to him first. Judas was the first one who initiated, said, "I will sell Jesus. How much will you give me?" And they weighed out 30 pieces of silver to him, and from then on he began looking for a good opportunity to betray Jesus. This is Wednesday of Passion Week. At the table of the Last Supper, Jesus saw and knew that there were 30 pieces of silver in Judas Iscariot's purse. He saw this and he knew it all. Jesus could not even have the Passover meal. He couldn't even eat unleavened bread. And he takes the bread and the wine and he shares it. And he knew that the purse of Judas Iscariot had 30 pieces of silver in it. And he thinks to himself, he got paid. He got paid to sell me. And so one of the disciples asks Jesus, "Who's going to be the one to sell you?" And Jesus says, "The bread that I take and dip it and I give it to that disciple, he's the one that will sell me." So he takes this bread and gives it to Judas Iscariot. And if Judas Iscariot had any sort of sense, he would say, no, I'm not going to sell you. Even though I have the money, he could have lied and says, I'm not going to sell Jesus right now. How can I sell you, master? All he needed to do was not take that bread. But even that, shamelessly, he takes the bread. And at that very moment, you can't see Satan. He's a spiritual being. And at that moment, Satan entered into Judas. And from then on, however Satan controlled him, that's how he moved. And he slips away in the middle of the feast. At that moment, it was night. It was Thursday night. Jesus said that the one whom I give a piece of bread after I've dipped it is the one who will betray me. John chapter 13, verse 21. When Jesus had said this, he became troubled, right? And one of you will betray me. And in verse 26, that is the one for whom I shall dip the morsel and give it to him. He took and gave to Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot. At this moment, Judas Iscariot should not have accepted the piece of bread that the Lord offered him, but he received it shamelessly. And at that moment, Satan entered into Judas's heart. John chapter 13, verse 27. Let's read it together. Begin. After the morsel, Satan then entered into him. Therefore Jesus said to him, "What you do, do quickly." And then Judas Iscariot slipped away to come with Roman soldiers and religious leaders in order to arrest Jesus. John chapter 13, verse 30. So after receiving the morsel, he went out immediately, and it was night. As soon as he took that bread, Satan entered into him. And as soon as Satan entered into him, he left, and it was night. Jesus says, "I am the light of the world." And of course, yes, literally it was night. But spiritually, it meant that Judas had not even a single ounce of intention to follow the light of Jesus. Darkness completely took over Judas at this time. So there was no intention in Judas Iscariot's heart to follow the light of Jesus. John chapter 8, verse 12, Jesus again spoke to them, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me will not walk in the darkness, but will have the light of life. Today, you and I, as long as we only follow Jesus, then that light of life will be with us, our families, workplaces. In conclusion, the Lord sought even a single disciple who would remain awake. Awake. But amongst the 12 disciples, not a single one of them was awake. Even in the Garden of Gethsemane, when Jesus was praying, he says, keep watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. Matthew chapter 26, verse 41, Mark chapter 14, verse 38, same thing. Those who are awake will not fall into temptation. Luke chapter 22, verse 40 and verse 46, pray that you may not enter into temptation. Get up and pray. When we pray and we stay awake, that we will not fall into these kinds of temptations. You know, you and I, think of the times in the past when we were tempted. You know, it was nothing, and yet I was tempted. You know, for example, if someone offered you some rice, all you needed to do was not take it. And let's say you're trying to eat, you know, there's people that are tested because, they only accept 650 at a time and they're not going to accept me until 30 minutes later. You know, being tested, being tempted of these kinds of trivial things, they are indicators that we are not spiritually awake. Because those who are spiritually awake in prayers, no matter what form those temptations take of the devil, we win against all of them. Those who fall into temptation are not disciples who are awake. The disciples fell into the temptations of power and greed. Not even a single disciple was awake. Not even a single disciple understood this, and not even a single disciple prepared the Passover meal for Jesus. And so Jesus, as he teaches us the Lord's Prayer, even in the Lord's Prayer, it says, do not lead us into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This is the Lord's Prayer. You know, Father God, please do not lead me into temptation. Until the day I get to heaven, we must not be tempted. We must not be tempted because of money, food. You know, some people were picked, some people weren't picked. Some people are taken care of, some people aren't taken care of, so we get tempted or tested. And so it's so far we get tempted or tested. The devil always tests us with things that he knows we are vulnerable to. But those who are spiritually awake and in prayer are not tested. We do not fall into temptation. We say, sure, you can do whatever you want. I'll never be tempted. Even the prayer meetings that we have in front of the gate, you know, they have the tent and they curse us on the sides, and it infuriates us. And even me, you know, my head is about to burst with anger. At that moment, I'm being tested. So if your head is about to burst from anger, then close it. Close it immediately. But let's say it's open continuously. Then from my mouth, certain curse words may come out. I might ram them with my shoulder. And then there's another testing. Oh, I did all this, but the church is not going to pay for my legal proceedings. But we're so, once we're tested once or twice, we immediately think, I don't want to go to church. I don't feel like going to church. And so we get lower and lower. That is what the devil wants. When Jesus taught us the Lord's Prayer, he's praying every single day. Do not lead us into temptation. Until the day I get to heaven, please do not lead us into temptation. I don't want to be tested. Every single moment, we must pray in this way. So today, you and I, no matter what temptations may take fold, may we not fall into them. May we be victorious against them. And until the day that we are transfigured, may we follow only our Father God's words and be the ones who are truly victorious. And I bless you in the name of the Lord. So every time your lid is opened,